I love that song. Oh, thank you uh for indulging my headbanger tendencies. Um that song is a cover of a song done by Rage by the Machine. And it just perfectly, I think, leads us into our topic for today. I'm sorry, Rage Against the Machine. Um, leads us into our topic for today because in order to even consider the idea of unchaining from the patriarchy, we first have to wake up to the understanding that we are imprisoned. And we have to wake up to the understanding of who we are imprisoned. And we're living in this bizarre time where the word woke So apparently Big Brother doesn't want me to talk about the woke movement, since we just got booted back, booted out and brought back in. So yes, Big Brother, we know you're watching and listening. When we talk about being woke, we're talking about being awake. We're talking about seeing and understanding where we are being imprisoned and by whom. And so this song is a call, it's a plea, it is a begging and a pleading to the universe, to the people of this planet. Wake up. Wake up to what is right in front of you. Wake up to what is around you. Wake up to where you're really free, if you are. Wake up to the false promises. Wake up to the corruption. Wake up to the deceptions. Wake up to all those places where systems, institutions are trying to suppress you, your voice, your freedom, your truth. And we can boil all of that down to one word, and that one word is patriarchy, which has been the theme, the discussion of this course. The patriarchy can best be described as the outside perceived authority that has structured itself hierarchically with men having power and privilege. In the world in which we are currently living, the power and privilege is held most commonly by white men, but patriarchy is not limited to those of European descent. It is an institutional construct based in fear, rooted in division, and predicated upon the idea that there is an us and a them, those that have power, those that don't, and that there is a specific portion of the population. Ultimately, he who holds the gold makes the rules. And this is a structure that's been in place for thousands and thousands of years. So this is nothing new to humanity. And yet we find ourselves at this time where we can actually name this as the imprisoner. We can name the patriarchy as that which does not seek to support or provide for or empower, but seeks to enslave. And talking about patriarchy in this way is not anti-male. I think that's an important thing to make note of. It is not anti-masculine. Instead, it is pro-humanity. It's pro-collaboration. It's pro-unity. It acknowledges that not the patriarchy. In talking about the patriarchy in this way, as imprisoner, we are acknowledging that as human beings, we long for and yearn for something that is unitive and unifying, something that celebrates our diversity, something that seeks out and empowers our unique giftedness, and does so not for the benefit of the few, but the benefit of the all. And you wouldn't be in this circle today if you weren't seeking after that level of human connection and integration and collaboration and cooperation, seeking after understanding, putting an end to war, and coming together in peace. And that journey begins with each of us as individuals. For in order to be a force of change, in order to be a force that helps bring people together and lift people up, we first have to do that inner work of freeing ourselves. And in order to do that, we have to acknowledge the places in our lives where we have been conditioned by the patriarchy and the beliefs, the patterns, the behaviors that we are unconsciously enacting because of this conditioning. And this conditioning is so deep and so insidious that we often don't even recognize that our behaviors, our thought patterns, our belief systems have arisen solely out of this patriarchal conditioning until we start to do the work and until we start to peel back the layers. And we find that we begin with the most obvious. What are the most obvious places in our lives where we have been impacted by patriarchal conditioning? And we've had an opportunity over the last few weeks to uncover some of that. What are the things that are obvious? Sexism is an obvious one. Places, especially in this circle, places in our lives where we have been given fewer opportunities because we're women, or where it was harder for us to make a place in the world because we were women, or ways in which we've been sexualized, or places where we've experienced sexual harassment, or where we're told to be quiet because women don't speak out loud, or where we have an opinion, or we have a piece of advice that might help the circle or the institution or the company that we're working for, and that idea is dismissed, only later to be discovered it was the new idea of some man in the organization. These are all ways in which we have been obviously impacted by patriarchal conditioning. In addition to those obvious ways are the subtle and often invisible. But again, as we start tackling those more obvious places, then the subtle begins to appear and bring itself into view. And today we're going to be working with a very subtle piece of patriarchal conditioning. And that very subtle piece is the word guilt. Now, in order to, I'm going to make a distinction between guilt and shame for the purposes, number one, of our own inner exploration and for the purposes of our own practice. And my definition is different than what you might find elsewhere. So if you've heard it in reverse order, then just for this purpose, go with what I'm telling you. Shame to me is something that is built within our human consciousness and is a kind of alert system. Yeah, alert system is probably the best way to describe it. The way I define shame is that it is the internal, emotional, and visceral response to non-loving actions being done to us, or alternatively, when we are doing non-loving actions towards someone else. This, I believe, is one of our survival skills, survival instincts. It is that signaling system within us that says something non-loving is being done to me in this moment. And that non-loving action is harmful to me. And by being harmful to me, it is harmful to the community. A very obvious example of this is in situations of childhood sexual abuse. There is a physical, visceral response in the child when that non-loving action is done to them. Now, the challenge is that, and this is where our how do I want to say this? Our instinctual responses without proper training get us in trouble. Or I could better say, how our instinctual responses become distorted. It is appropriate to have a visceral reaction to someone that is infringing upon our personal safety and our personal boundaries. It is appropriate to have that visceral response. It is our body saying, this is not okay. And yet, what happens in our culture is that visceral response, instead of being a catalyst for action, it becomes internalized, which then puts the victim into a place of freeze, immobilizing them and preventing them from being able to take action. Now, we'll have more understanding of that when we get into the guilt piece. But shame in this context is simply an instinctual response to something harmful being done to us. In a person with developed consciousness, so I would say sociopaths and psychopaths don't qualify in this realm, but everybody else has some sort of instinctual understanding within themselves that we are not to be cruel, harmful, or harmful to another human being. And we have a natural signal within us that I call shame that tells us, don't do that. Don't do that. Or if we did do it, so like, for example, when I was a child, I got mad at my sister one time and I punched her. I felt bad. I felt bad because it was the right emotion to have after hitting my sister. I inflicted harm on another human being, and I felt bad for that. That is an appropriate shame response. It's what keeps us in that realm of loving action and kindness. It keeps us in the realm of safety, and it keeps us in the realm of what is for the good of the tribe. It's again, shame in this context is an internal, natural, instinctual response to non-loving action, either being done to us or being done by us to another. Guilt, on the other hand, guilt is not instinctual. Guilt is not natural. Guilt does not support ourselves in creating loving relationships with ourselves, others, or for the benefit of the tribe. Guilt is inflicted upon us by an outside perceived authority, specifically with the intent to control. Guilt is not part of who we are. Guilt is something that we're trained to feel. And I'm going to give you some really easy examples. If you don't go to church on Sunday, you're going to go to hell. You try to name and claim your needs, and you feel guilty for that. When you're made to feel guilty for expressing your truth, when you feel guilt because you feel angry about injustices in the world, all of these are responses that we've been trained to have. Speaking out against injustices and feeling guilty. Speaking out against an abuser and feeling guilty. Telling the family secret and feeling guilty. All of these are conditioned responses. They have nothing to do with our truth. They have nothing to do with who we are. We simply feel guilty because we were taught to feel guilty by the outside perceived authority that wants to control us. And that authority is your doctor, who makes you feel guilty for advocating for yourself, or a family member, or a loved one. The outside perceived authority is your teacher, who punishes you for spelling a word incorrectly. Your pastor, who tries to make you feel bad for missing church on Sunday, for living in sin. Your employer, who expects 80 hours of work on a 40-hour salary. And then makes you feel guilty for calling in sick because you are sick. Or you're a mother and you're nursing, and your employer doesn't give you space and time, or rolls their eyeballs, or calls it a challenge to give you space and time for pumping breast milk so that your child can continue to receive the benefits of nursing. Your spouse, who makes you feel guilty for spending money on yourself, who makes you feel guilty when you ask for help and support in the home, who makes you feel guilty for wanting the same rights that they have. The voice inside of your head that says it's your job to be nice. The voice in your head that says it's your job to take care of everybody else's needs, and your needs come last. Or maybe you don't really deserve to have needs. This system of guilt is, I think, ultimately the strongest weapon of the patriarchy. Because that guilt is what is used to keep us imprisoned. It makes us feel less than. It makes us believe we're not allowed to have needs. We're not allowed to have emotions. We're not allowed to seek balance in our lives. We're not allowed to have what we want. All of the punishment that is threatened by the patriarchy means nothing without the weapon of guilt. Because, okay, so the church says you don't go to Sunday, if you don't go to Mass on Sunday, you're going to hell. If I didn't feel guilty about not going to Mass on Sunday, I wouldn't give a shit about hell. If I didn't feel guilty for naming and claiming my needs, I would name and claim my needs. If I didn't feel guilty for taking a sick day, I would take a sick day and damn the job. I'd go find a different job someplace. One that values work-life balance, that understands people are sick sometimes. This guilt is like a rope around our neck or a gun to our head. And it is that which keeps us imprisoned. One of the most liberating things that we can do for ourselves is to be free of guilt. Not shame, not that natural internal signal that tells us when we are being non-loving or someone's being non-loving to us, but guilt, that which is imposed on us by the status quo, by the outside perceived authority, and those complicit in that system. So let me give an example of where this guilt and shame gets twisted and confusing. So we have this natural instinct within us, this natural signal system that tells us when, I'll use an easy example, when our boundaries are being infringed upon. So let's see if I can come up with a good example. Okay, I got one. A friend or a family member comes up to us and asks us, will you do blah, 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 blah for me? And we have this instinct inside of us is like, I don't think so. Either there's something about this request that feels wrong. That's not how I want to spend my time. This doesn't feel safe to me in some way. So we have this instinctual response that says, no, I don't think that's a good idea. But then we have the voice of guilt that climbs up over the back of our head and says, well, you have to do that, or that person won't care for you anymore, or they'll be mad at you, or they'll have a fit, or they'll decide not to be your friend, whatever that blah, 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 blah is. This instinct that says, no, that's not good for me, gets overridden by the guilt that says, if you name and claim your needs and say no to that, you're going to be disappointing someone. They're going to be angry with you. They won't want to be friends with you anymore. So what wins out? The instinctual response that says, this isn't healthy for me, which we would then follow up with, thank you for giving me that invitation, but I'm not able to do that at this time. That would be the healthy, most loving thing to do for yourself. But until we get rid of this guilt demon, that guilt voice is going to override it. And we're going to say yes when we really want to say no. So now We've ignored that signal inside of us, that instinctual signal that was there to tell us this request does not feel safe to me. This is not a request that would be fulfilling this request would not be loving for me. We override that and give into this voice of guilt. When we free ourselves of that voice of guilt, then this overarching thing that says, well, you better say yes, otherwise that person is going to be disappointed in you. We can say, oh, there's that guilt demon. Push that aside. Then we can reconnect with that voice, that true inner voice that says, no, I can't do this at this time. And we can do that freely without feeling guilty, without having to apologize, without having to make excuses. We're simply naming and claiming our needs. Overriding, I call it the guilt demon because it is. It's the voice of the devil. This is not our higher self. It's not God. It's not our truth that says, oh, you better do that or this person might be angry. Our truth says, I know what's life-giving for me, and I'm going to name and claim what that is. I'm going to say no when I want to say no, and say yes when I want to say yes. I'm going to speak out in that meeting, even though that voice of guilt is saying, oh, you better keep your mouth shut because you're going to be raising a ruckus. You're going to be disturbing the peace. You're going to be rocking the boat. You're going to be making people angry. Absolving ourselves of that guilt is one of the most important things we can do for ourselves in our healing journey and unraveling from the patriarchy. So for this week, for today, I'm going to be sharing a practice with you that I'm going to invite you into. I'm going to extend an invitation that you give yourself time and space and permission in the next week to do this practice every day. And the simplest way, the most effective way of doing this practice, if you're able, is to set 5 minutes aside a day. Maybe it's first thing in the morning, maybe it's the end of your day, and do this practice around guilt. And the practice is called Tonglen, and it's a Buddhist practice, Tonglen. It's a Tibetan Buddhist practice that allows us to become immersed in discomfort for the purpose of transforming it. So there's a Buddhist saying that says, what we resist will persist. Tonglen puts that saying into practice by putting us into the center of what it is we resist. So we want to get rid of guilt. How do we get rid of guilt? We can't just get rid of it. We have to change it. And that is an internal process. Tonglen gives us the vehicle for changing that guilt from guilt to liberation. So I'm going to take us through a simple Tonglen practice. We're going to be doing this practice together. And I'll have a time set aside that we can do this together. And then after we've had a time to do this practice, we'll have some time for sharing and discussion. So I'm going to invite you into a Tonglen practice. And so to begin that, I invite you to be seated comfortably. So if you're in a chair, to feel comfortable in that chair. If you're lying down, to feel comfortable in that lying down position. To allow your hands to be open and free. And I invite you to close your eyes. And we're going to start this practice with just a few cleansing breaths. So I invite you to draw in a breath and give it release. To draw it in and give it release. And draw it in and give it release. As you're allowing yourself to tend to that breathing, allow that attentive presence to bring you into a relaxed and peaceful state. In that relaxed and peaceful state, I invite you to bring into mind, maybe it's a recent experience, maybe it's an ongoing pattern, maybe it's a preoccupation, to bring into mind an experience where you felt or heard that voice of guilt. That voice that said, oh, don't do that, or do this or else. Try to draw into mind a specific, maybe recent experience where you felt or heard or experienced the prevalent voice of guilt. Once you've brought an experience to mind, with your eyes continuing to be closed, see if you can identify a place in your body where you feel the sensation of that guilt. Or maybe where you feel its voice. Maybe it's creeping up the back of your neck or whispering in your ear. Maybe you feel it as a weight on your chest or an upset stomach or a pain in your neck. Give yourself permission to identify where that pattern of guilt is crouching in you. Now, if you've been able to identify where you're feeling that guilt, Now we enter into the fullness of the Tonglen practice. So while you are feeling that sensation of guilt, you're invited to breathe into it while you're feeling it. And breathe out love. Breathing into the guilt where you're feeling it and breathing out love. Breathing into the guilt and breathing out love. And we will rest together in silence as we continue that practice. And we'll be in that practice for the next 5 minutes. I invite you to begin to bring that practice to a close.